Hey guys, it's time to move on to the fifth anticipated objection to the identity thesis in a strict sense, which remember is all about the fact that if a thing occurs in the same spatial and temporal context and they coexist, obviously they are the same thing, right? Now let's go over what we've talked about previously. If you'll notice in objection 1, objection 2, and objection 2, and we skipped objection 3. We went straight on to objection 4, which is a bit different. But in objection 1 and 2, we talked about sensation. But in objection 4 and 5, we talk about experience. That's a real key difference. So in this argument, we're going to look at a possible argument that tries to explain how experience is different from brain processes, not necessarily how, what can I say, sensation is different from brain processes. That was basically the main focus of some previous objections that we've already covered, okay? So what are we going to do? Well, what we always do, we're going to explore Smart's reply to his fifth anticipated objection to his identity thesis in the strict sense, which means we're going to have to name and define and interrelate key terms, which means we're going to have to explore a summary of how he replies to the possible objection, and then we're going to have to read and trace how he develops that argument by exploring the nuances and the coherence of his logic through the written word. All right, so write these down for me, pretty please, with the cherry on top. And once you've done that, can you have a look at this picture here and just tell me what this tale is all about? Thank you. All right, so if you said it was all about the tortoise and the hare race, you're absolutely correct. Now, we're not looking for the moral conclusion, which is that if slow and steady wins the race. We're actually just trying to differentiate between slow and fast, or slowly and swift. And our mate Smart basically says, look, one thing some people will bring up is the fact that when you look at brain processes, you can explain those brain processes or describe those brain processes as being either slow or swift. But when you see the color yellow, you can't use that language. You can't use the language of slow or swift to explain your experience of seeing yellow, right? Now, here's the key difference. Therefore, the experience of something is not the same as the brain process. We're not talking about sensation. We're talking about experience. That's real key. And Smart says, look, I've kind of had similar arguments that responded to sensation, but now I'm going to apply them to how we think about experience, okay? So the definitions we use to describe how we experience things from a phenomenal sense, and the key terms we use to explain that, and the logic we use to explain it, are very different from the way that we explain brain processes. In fact, they don't have the same meaning. They don't mean the same thing, but they refer to the same ontological thing. Just like sensation and brain processes refer to the same ontological thing, though they have a language and a system of logic that means something different, the same can be said about the language of experience and the same can be said about the language of brain processes. And an important analogy that he uses to explain this is, look, okay, we can only say some things about describing a someone or a somebody, right? And these are different things when compared to explaining what we say about a doctor. Obviously, we can say a lot, well, things that are very different when we're talking about a particular doctor, but we can't say the same things about a someone. They have to be quite general. So we have two different types of logic, two different key terms, two different ways of explaining and describing these two things. But if we're talking about a someone who just so happens to be a doctor, it's the name or the key term that makes us describe something differently, but we're actually referring to the one ontological thing. All right. And the same is said about experience and brain processes. The language we use to describe experience has completely different meaning, and the language we use to explain brain processes has completely different meaning, but they're actually pointing to the same ontological thing in the background, okay? The real thing. Remember, ontology is the study of essence or reality or or what is real would be a better way of describing it. Okay, so we can point that out with a Venn diagram. Here I have a circle which represents what can be said about someone or about experience. And here I have another circle which represents what can be said about a doctor or brain processes. And I'm trying to point out through the Venn diagram they're very different, but what they have in common is what is referred to. So it's kind of a nice visual summary. You might want to use that to kind of sum up all the arguments we've come up with so far. All right, so I hope you've taken a note. But then he moves on to say basically, but hang on, okay, you can also adapt your language to describe what we would usually use as phenomenal experience or phenomenal language to describe experience, but now we can describe our experiences with reference to physical things. We can actually change the language we describe to refer to experience by making it refer to physical things that actually occur. And then he says, look, okay, so what we need to then conclude from this is just because the semantics, which basically means meaning, semantics means meanings, right? It's the science of meanings. Just because the semantics we use to describe phenomena or to understand how we experience things is kind of out of step about what we know about the actual nature of things. It doesn't disprove in any way, shape, or form what we actually really know about the nature of things. So let me just rephrase that, all right? Just because the language we use or the semantics or the meanings we have to describe things doesn't really sit with what we actually know about the nature of physical things, doesn't mean that we disprove the nature of physical things, because the meaning we use in the other sense is different. Take a note. All right, so like I said, because we've gone through and we've referred to a lot of the previous objections, this stuff should make a lot of sense. It should be much clearer. So let's go through and read what he has to say, and then we'll call it a day, shall we? Okay. It would make sense to say of a molecular movement in the brain that it is swift or slow, straight or circular, but it makes no sense to say this of the experience of seeing something yellow. We should really get that. Don't need to take notes. The reply, so far we have not given sense to talk of experiences as swift or slow, straight or circular. So he's saying, yeah, that's correct. We can't use that language to describe experience or how we experience. But I'm not claiming that experience and brain processes mean the same thing or even that they have the same logic. There you go. We've kind of pointed that in summary. Somebody and the doctor do not have the same logic, but this does not lead us to suppose that talking about somebody telephoning is talking about someone over and above, say, the doctor. Same thing we said before. You don't really need to take any extra notes because the notes have been taken. The ordinary man, when he reports an experience, is reporting that something is going on, but he leaves it open to what sort of thing is going on. So he's saying, look, I see something, but what actually is happening, I don't know. Maybe you should take a note because that is a nuance. I quite like that quote. The ordinary man, when he reports to an experience, or he reports an experience that's going on, is still leaving it open as to what sort of thing is going on. So he's not necessarily telling you what is going on, he's just saying something is going on. Whether in a material solid medium, or perhaps in some sort of gaseous medium, or even perhaps in some sort of non-spatial medium, if this makes sense. All that I'm saying is that experience and brain processes may in fact refer to the same thing, and if so, we may easily adopt a convention, which is not a change in our present rules for the use of experience words, but in addition to them, where it would make sense to talk of an experience in terms of appropriate to physical processes. So let me give you an example. We've already taken a note about that. We could say quite easily that neurons are firing in my brain to produce the sensation of seeing the yellow square. But more in line with this, instead of saying sensation, I'll refer to experience. My neurons and certain circuits are firing in my brain to produce the experience I have of sensing that yellow color. You get what I mean? And obviously we've added to and adapted the phenomenal language we would use to describe the overall process. Now, this should make a lot of sense because we've gone over harder ground, right? We've built prior concepts, and he's just scaffolding. He's just scaffolding his ideas one upon one, and you'll find that obviously that just seems to be a lot clearer. So let's go over our things. We named and defined key terms. We certainly did. We understand that we're talking about experience. We understand we're talking about the fact that logic, semantics, and meaning may be different, but they might refer to the one true ontological thing. I particularly like the point of view he made when we were reading that, by describing what is occurring doesn't mean you're describing how it is occurring or what's going on beneath it. You might want to take a note about that. That might help you understand what he's really talking about. Summary we've done, and we've traced how he develops his reply quite easily. All right, so I hope that your notes have been pretty good, and I hope you've got a pretty good understanding of this reply. Just remember, he's talking about logic used to describe experience versus logic used to describe brain processes. He's not talking about logic used to describe sensation, which was what he developed in his reply to Objection 2. Cheers.